Okay, so maybe I'll just start with a slightly, more casual introduction while we're waiting for people. We finally got the books themselves in. So exciting. So I'm just gonna flip through here so you can see how pretty it is. Oh, and this is, these are both from Rosemary Waldrop's Camp Printing, the cover and then also the frontis pieces.
Beautiful.
Looks great.
And then here's our fold out. Let's see if I can get it. It's Jeffrey Pethy Bridges' piece, and it's full color, and I just love flipping through it. It feels like a art object. So some people on here, I think, have ordered a copy, so they just came in, so I'll go ahead and send them up now that they're here. So that's that. If you do want a copy and you haven't ordered, you can get it on our website on the issue 1 page. It'll just prompt you to send an email basically to the Manifold website, and then I've been trying to do them in batches, so if I haven't responded with the PayPal or whatever, I will soon and get those off to you, because now they're here. And there's lots of boxes in my basement too. Okay, so that's the news on the actual book, which is, at least for me and Emma, the reason for being, I guess, for the symposium, but certainly this particular panel, we have a slightly, more focused attention on multilingualism. So I'm just gonna sort of read a short intro and then we'll go directly into Robin's presentation. And for the order here today, we have Robin, then Carlos, then Lindsay, and then Ghazal. So if that still works for you, we'll just move through that and then we'll be on to the Q&A. Also, I do have linked on the events page. Ghazal, I don't have a piece of yours linked, but if you would like me to link to a piece, I can do that on the website. And then the other 3, I do have links that will be live for the next week. So if you want to read the pieces, the links to at least Lindsay's translation and Robin's translation will be up for the next week. And then we have a link to Carlos's project as well. So you can see what they're talking about after the event. You can go read.
Well, Jenny, I'm reading from a long piece. So do you mean I just sent the picture?
If you have a piece that you want me to link to,
I'm just reading it
so that people can see your work on the page, then just let me know and I'll link to that.
Sure, great. Yeah.
Okay, great. So as far as this being the multilingual criticism panel, we at Manifold understand multilingual criticism to include both critical texts which engage multilingual literature, as well as acts of critical thinking which travel between tongues, including the act of translation. Like multilingual literature, this criticism traces movement across and within social and cultural spaces, embodying the reality of a multilingual society and the variety of linguistic encounters it offers. And indeed, pursuant to a burgeoning 21st century interest in issues of multiculturalism, mass migration, and globalization, literary studies has become more attuned to the possibilities of multilingual writing. But as Yasemin Yildiz points out in Beyond the Mother Tongue, the post-monolingual condition, multilingualism is not a contemporary phenomenon. In fact, it's the idea of the monolingual society, which is comparatively new, bound to modernity and to the hegemonies of the nation state. So when we talk about multilingualism as an experiment here in this context, perhaps we use that moniker anachronistically. Nevertheless, contemporary literature and with it, contemporary criticism has seen the burgeoning of a variety of multilingual practices, from self-translation to comparative anthologies, from critical code switching to translingual histories, We are, as Gloria Ansel-Dua said in her seminal work of multilingual criticism, newly returned to the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. And our first presenter, Robin Myers, translated a piece in Manifold by Cristina Rivera Garza, Disappropriation for Beginners. She's also a poet, and she grew up in the United States and lives in Mexico City. She was among the winners of the 2019 Poem and Translation Contest held by Words Without Borders and the Academy of American Poets. Recent or forthcoming translations include The Restless Dead by Cristina Rivera Garza, Vanderbilt 2020, Cars on Fire by Monica Ramon Rios, Open Letter Books 2020, Animals at the End of the World by Gloria Susana Esquivel, University of Texas 2020, and Lyric Poetry is Dead by Ezekiel Zaydenwerk, Cardboard House Press 2018. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Robin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jenny and Emma. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and I'm so excited to hear more about the work of Carlos, Ghazal, and Lindsay. I just want to say at the beginning that there's a lot of drilling going on in my building. So if it's unbearable, I mean, there's nothing I can do about it, but I would like to know. So if you could just, apologies in advance. And thank you again, just for this incredible symposium you've put together. It's so exciting to hear so many disciplines, so many places, so many practices in conversation with each other. I would like to talk a little bit about translation in general and a little bit about translating Cristina Rivera Garza's book, The Restless Dead. And a fragment of this book was published in Manifold as Disappropriation for Beginners. Since Cristina herself isn't here and couldn't make it to the earlier session when she was going to talk about that piece, I'd like to focus on that piece sort of in broader terms for now, and then would be really thrilled to talk about anything more specific, more process-based later if we have time. I'm going to be reading from some notes because of nerves. When Emma and Jenny sent us some initial thoughts about this panel, I was excited and also really heartened to see them describe translation itself as a form of criticism. I love this because it necessarily flies in the face of one of the great cliches and misconceptions, and ultimately a really, I think, damaging myth about translation as this sort of passive neutral act, that a translator is this kind of empty vessel and that the translator is not equally engaged, implicit, complicit with social and political realities and consequences in addition to aesthetic ones. And so in anticipation of this conversation, I tried to step back and reflect on how I, not an academic, not even a graduate student, not a translator primarily of criticism, think of criticism in general. This is a sort of nod also to the title of Cristina's text, where she talks about the idea of a beginner as this sort of important thing to hold on to when we learn anything, that we are all beginners when we are learning. And so I feel that I am a beginner as a translator always, and as a receiver of criticism. After an initial spell of sort of insecure hemming and hawing, there was a phrase that came to mind for me, which is that criticism is a study of decisions in context. And what followed for me is that translation is a practice of decisions in context. It's an immersion in the decisions made by an artist in their context, in their language, a meditation on the possibilities and limitations at work in the translation's own context and language. And it's another set of active, intentional decisions made by the translator in connection with all of the above. There is nothing neutral about any of that. And most importantly, I think, when you translate, you are never alone. You are, by definition, unable to be alone. You are the opposite of being alone. You are writing with not only the text you're translating and its author, but also with the ideas, readings, voices, communities, conflicts, struggles that participate in the author's work. And of course, with all of those things that have seeped into and been digested by your own thinking, your own positioning in the worlds you're part of. Which is all very convenient for me, I have to say, because this is exactly what Cristina's essay is about. I'd like to quote the text here from a section called "Writing is Work." Writing is not the result of inexplicable individual inspiration, but rather a form of material labor undertaken by concrete bodies in contact, tense, volatile, unresolved contact with other bodies at specific times and in specific places. Writings, in other words, are bodies in context. As these bodies engage in contact with the common good that is language itself, the work of writing participates in different processes of production and reproduction of social wealth. In this sense, a writer doesn't represent reality. Rather, she presents it, that is, she produces it, in relation, or not, to literary traditions for their future reproduction through reading. Quickly, too, I'd also like to share, slightly paraphrased, a passage about the concept of disappropriation in itself. Here is Christina again. The dictionary, in its most basic definition of the term, disappropriate, to remove something that has been allocated to someone, offers a call to action. It involves the critical renunciation of what capital L literature has always done, appropriating others' voices and experiences for its own benefit and its own hierarchies of influence. The comprehensive goal of disappropriation is to return all writing to its plural origin. Disappropriation reveals the communal work of a language's practitioners and marks it as a source of creative work itself. In turn, it shows us the forms of self-production and the stories shared by collective subjects of enunciation. More than denouncing appropriation, disappropriation announces it, that is, cracks it open, manifesting it in aesthetically relevant ways. Far from serving as a police force that hunts down any instance of appropriation in sight, the disappropriative aesthetic produces writing strategies that embrace, welcome, and ultimately incorporate in open, playful, nonconformist ways the writing done by others. As a result, its way of appearing is usually attained through many different rewriting strategies, including excavation, recycling, and juxtaposition. In short, I'd say that Christina's work fundamentally challenges the primacy not just of authorship, but of ownership, that idea of the author as the owner of a text or of an idea, and advocates for writing practices that acknowledge the fact that we are always already together, working with and working thanks to others, whether or not we acknowledge it. Disappropriative writing does acknowledge it. And as I translated a book about disappropriative writing, I began to think more and more about translation as a practice of disappropriative writing, which is, of course, a kind of criticism too. Later in the same essay and throughout the whole book, The Restless Dead, Cristina discusses a term coined by Floriberto Diaz, who's a Mije anthropologist from the highlands of Oaxaca. This term is comunalidad, or communality. The community becomes communality, writes Cristina, through a series of characteristics that Diaz calls immanent, with an a relationship with the earth that isn't a relationship of property, but rather of mutual belonging based, moreover, on labor, defining the latter as the labor of materialization, which ultimately also means the recreation of the created. And what is translation if not a collaborative materialization, the recreation of the created? Just as an aside here, which shouldn't be an aside, but in fact the whole point, I think, of many of these conversations is that in lots of ways, academia and the publishing industry and an artistic culture that still falls prey to concepts like genius and stardom and overall individualism and so forth do privilege a relationship of property. And translators, not to mention publishers and readers of translations, can be guilty of that too. There is no immunity there. And I think it's important to stress that the very act of translation, especially into English, which is the most hegemonic of all hegemonic languages, is not an automatically ethical act. We could have a whole other conversation about how translation is construed as an inherent moral good, or about the destructively gatekeepery qualities of the English language publishing world. These are conversations I would love to have. But returning to Cristina's essay, as a writer and a translator and a reader, I see Floriberto Diaz's idea of communality and Cristina's application of those ideas to writing as a practice as a continuous challenge and a continuous invitation. There's another passage in The Restless Dead where Cristina describes hypothetical books made solely or almost entirely of acknowledgements pages, which is usually this tiny space at the beginning devoted to recognizing the different people who have had a hand in the making of the book. Maybe in the future, she says, it won't be impossible to envision books that are just that, sheer recognition, which means sheer critical questioning of the dynamic and pluralistic relationship that enables their existence in the first place. And what is recognition, if not pure gratitude? I would just like, in conclusion for now, to repeat that last line as a way to think about multilingual criticism and translation together. Sheer recognition means sheer critical questioning of the dynamic and pluralistic relationship that enables their existence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. If you could unmute yourselves and make some noise.
Yay!
That was really wonderful. And so, yeah, so much to think about. But I am going to move on and introduce our next speaker. Carlos Soto Roman is a poet and translator. In the United States, he has published Common Sense from Make Now Press in 2019, Bluff with Commune Editions from 2018, Alternative Set of Procedures with Corollary Press 2014, The Exit Strategy, Belladonna 2014, Chile Project Reclassified 2013, and Philadelphia's Notebooks with Autoliths in 2011. In the UK, he published Nature of Objects with our co-host Pamenar Press in 2019. And in Chile, he self-published 11 in 2017, which was awarded the Poetry Municipal Prize in 2018. He was the curator of the Cooperative Anthology of US Poetry Elective Affinities. He resided in Philadelphia, where he was a member of the New Philadelphia Poets. He was also a student of the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics at Europa University and a MacDowell Fellow. He currently lives and works in Santiago, Chile. Today, Carlos will be talking to us about the Colectivo Frank Ocean, which emerged in early 2018 as a poetry and translation workshop in Santiago, Chile. Since October 2019, amidst Chilean social outbreak, the group felt the urgency to think about new forms of resistance to confront police violence, which worsened over the following weeks, leaving hundreds of demonstrators irreversibly injured, blind, and some dead. From poetry and translation, a community space was created to rescue voices that had rebelled against police repression, mainly migrant authors, Afro-descendants, women, and members of the LGBTQ+ community who inhabited the margins of language and territory. One of the first actions of the group consisted of pasting posters of their translations in the surroundings of Plaza Dignidad in the middle of one of the demonstrations in order to contribute with poetry and solidarity to the protests happening in the streets. Later on, they focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, which further stressed the inequalities that had been deepening in Chile for several decades, and that forced them to look for new ways to distribute work. For the first anniversary of the social outbreak, they selected a few poems against the police, but also against racism, patriarchy, and domestic violence, with the intention of opening a dialogue with other territories, which unfortunately also experience these types of violence. This project feels in line with our mission at Manifold, not only through investigating translation as a site of potential critical acts, but also through the multimedia and off-the-page expanded field of engagement. And with that, I will turn it over to Carlos. And Carlos, let me know when you want me to put up these slides.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Emma, for that introduction, and Jenny for having me. And Manifold for all this wonderful symposium that you're putting together. And it's such an honor to be invited to this panel. Yeah, I prepared like a small presentation, some slides to basically show you what are we doing with the Frank Ocean Collective. This Colectivo or group started as a translation group mainly. You know, it was formed by young poets that were really interesting in seeking new ways of like exploring translation and also to explore you know, translation here and again, Latin America is being like basically dominated by a foreign translation, like particularly the ones we received from Spain, which are kind of like very particular translations. They use a certain kind of slang, and they tend to feel like kind of like, you know, not very close to us. So we're always longing for a kind of translation that is, it's more organic, it's more, you know, like, I guess, not only smooth, but kind of represent, or it could be more in touch or in a close dialogue with our own realities. So I guess that's why at a certain point, you know, translation started to grow in the country. The government was able to support that endeavor with some funding, and of course, independent press houses also play a fundamental role publishing emergent translators. So amidst that environment, Frank Ocean Collective started, you know, with people that wanted to, like really young writers and translators that wanted to, you know, discuss and talk about their own work, their own translations, and share experiences and share knowledge and different authors that they were reading. And in amid this thing, we had to face, you know, the social outbreak that occurred in October 2019, that kind of changed completely the direction of our focus. Emma, can we see the presentation? I have some slides too. I mean, it's going to be better if we see like the pictures. Can we see the next one? So, well, Colectivo Frank Ocean is the name of the collective. It's obviously based on Frank Ocean, the artist. I cannot be held accountable for the name, but I guess, you know, younger members of the collective are huge fans. So they decided to name the collective, the group, that way, and I think we just decided to keep it afterwards. Can we see the next one? So this was one of the first actions of the group. During the October manifestations in Plaza Dignidad, which is kind of like the center of the revolt here, where all the protests and demonstrations take place. There was a subway station which had a police precinct where and we found out that they were torturing people, that the cops were, like, you know, arresting and dragging them down to the subway station, and they were torturing people there. So one of the first actions that the collective, in a very organic way, you know, because those days, you know, people were just like naturally just going to the streets to demonstrate. And the collective decided that they wanted to be present with this simple gesture, that is this kind of a banner that says something like, here torture is committed. And it was in direct dialogue of another action that it took place during the dictatorship. Actually, during September of 1973, the movement against the torture was gathering for the first time, denouncing and pointing at places where Pinochet agents were committing torture. So this is, you know, I guess a way to establish, you know, like rewriting not only a detour, but also paying homage to other actions that were occurring in the past. And unfortunately, history was repeating again in Santiago. Can we see the next one, please? So we decided that we needed to respond to the structural and political and police violence and police brutality, you know, not writing new poems or not creating new work, but trying to see what was what happened outside, what had been written before, and trying to find some other works that would respond or could resonate in this very same context. So that's why we started looking for different poems and poets that were dealing with these topics. And we created this project called Poems Against the Police. And we decided in the first place to print some tiny posters that were supposed to be glued on the streets, particularly in the surroundings of Plaza Dignidad. And unfortunately, the COVID pandemic hit, so we only had the chance to visit Plaza Dignidad one time. And we just made like one series of posters, and that kind of forced us to think how we could continue the project in the middle of the lockdown and the confinement. Can we see the next one? So we came with the idea of having an Instagram account where we can create not only one posters, but many different graphics. And so we started working collectively on the translations. We had like the weekly meetings where we different members of the group were proposing different poems and different authors. We were focused on a particular one and try to work collectively in the translation. We will have a discussion, of course, and after that, the members that were more skilled in graphic and design and stuff created these wonderful slides, and we start posting them in this Instagram page. Can we move to the next one, please? So this is a few examples. There we have a translation by Anne Boyer, another one by Adrian Rich. We're looking to translate poets that were dealing with gender, race, and class issues that could resonate with the situations that we were facing here in Santiago. Trying to establish a dialogue. Can we see the following? Again, more posters, this one by June Jordan, another one by Audre Lorde. The graphics, will like usually represent the police brutality and the government, of course, like the incapacity of the government to deal with the social outbreak and also with the COVID crisis, the health crisis in the country. We have some other authors like Essex Hemphill and Jericho Brown. And other than these slides, we also been participated in different activities, like, for example, a sound collective called Estado Sonido organized like a kind of like DJ marathon where different sound artists and DJs were invited to a radio transmission that lasted like 2 days. And we collaborating, like recording clips of these translations with some music background. And all of this was intended to raise money for the political prisoners of the revolt. Also, some members of the collective participated editing an anthology of documentary poetry made by trans poets, and we've been we're trying to participate in presential readings, but during these times it's very difficult to do that. Can we see the next one, please? The other thing that's really interesting, well, we're basically translating from English, but some of the members also speak different language, Portuguese among them. And I think it's interesting how, particularly in South America, like basically all the countries, they speak Spanish except for Brazil. But other than the neighboring countries, like, I don't know, probably Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, the rest of us, we're not very familiar with Portuguese. despite the fact that Brazil has, a huge culture, not only literature, but also music, cinema. So I think that it's really important to promote, knowledge of Brazilian culture or Portuguese culture. And so we also, decided to incorporate some Portuguese speaking poets like Oswald Andrade and Adriana Lisboa. Can we see the next one? And another, important thing or component of this project is the visual, aspect. It's interesting that we are not only trying to move across languages, but also across forms and platforms. Using social media and using not only like plain text or the page as support, but also these slides. And for example, we have here a kind of like determinants or homage to different situations. Like for example, the first one is a mask that contain a message that it was inspired in the artist David Wojnarowicz when he used like a jacket with a similar message during the AIDS pandemic in the States, that it was saying something like, "If I die from AIDS, please drop my body at the steps of the FDA." So we kind of took that, and it was kind of a different way of translating that message. So we composed this slide that says something: "If I died of COVID-19, don't bury my body. Just drop them at the entry of the Ministry of Health." And the second one, it says "No puedo respirar," that is I can breathe, and obviously points to what happened in the States with George Floyd and the police brutality there. And that was kind of like really, resonates really hard here, because during the demonstrations, the police usually were gassing people with like huge amounts of tear gas. And we don't have much information about like the consequences of the long exposure to those toxic agents. So, and then COVID came, and it was kind of like really weird that the police insisted in gassing people in the middle of a respiratory disease pandemic. So that's why we kind of like created this slide using the Minneapolis police like badge, and also the sign of the local carabineros. Can we see the next one? Well, this is another component of the lockdown. People were usually romanticizing the quarantine or the confinement, saying like stay at home. But for some people, for certain communities, staying at home is not it was not safe at all. We kind of noticed that at the early months of the confinement, the reports on domestic violence increased severely. So we also did like a sort of campaign promoting, trying to establish like a support web to people who might feel that they were not safe staying at home because they might be living with an aggressor or an offender. So we started to raise awareness on this topic, and also promoting certain organizations that were dealing directly with this and they could help victims. So this was another, action that we're doing during these days. Can we see the next one? And yeah, when finally the lockdown was over, we could go back to Plaza Dignidad to stick some more posters and participate in the demonstrations. And we hopefully keep doing more slides and keeping with the translations. And well, one of the projects is trying to release an anthology with all the graphics and all the poems we've been translating. And also we have a free library, that is you can access to it through the Instagram account, which contains different translations, free translations made by members of the collective or some other translators that are related to the topics we're dealing with this project. And the next one, please. And well, this is a quote by Joshua Clover that kind of identifies what we're trying to do with translations and with poetry in this particular setting. And can we see the last one? And well, you have there the Instagram account and the Facebook and the names of the members of the collective. And I think my time is over, so that'll be it. Thank you so much for sharing the slides.
Go ahead.
Emma.
So, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. That was beautiful.
Thank you very much.
So our next presenter is Lindsey Turner. Let's hold this so that I'm not looking down so far. And Lindsey is the translator of Peter Sendi's piece in Manifold, The Third Eyelid. And her translations from the French, this is from the French, The Third Eyelid, and her other translations from the French include the poetry collections Adagio, Manantropo, you can tell that I don't speak French, by Ryoko Sekiguchi, The Next Loves by Stéphane Bouquet, Nightboat, who Nightboat sponsored an earlier panel of our symposium, as well as books of philosophy by Frederick Nerat. Utopia is co-translated with Walt Hunter, Fordham University Press, Soleiman Bashir Diagne, apologies, Post-Colonial Bergson, Fordham University Press, and Anne Dufourmentel in Defense of Secrets, Fordham University Press, which is forthcoming. She's also the author of a collection of poetry, songs, and ballads published by Prelude Books in 2018. She lives in Denver, where she's assistant professor in the Department of English and Literary Arts at the University of Denver. So we'll welcome Lindsay now, and apologies for my terrible French, and you'll now get to listen to her beautiful French.
Or I'll speak in English. My French is not beautiful, but thank you for that introduction, Jenny. Thanks, Emma and Jenny, for organizing this entire slate of symposia. It's so wonderful to be here in this virtual space. Thanks all of you for coming, and thank you, Robin and Carlos, for your presentations. They were fascinating. Robin, I feel like our presentations are going to overlap in certain ways. Ghazal, I'm so excited for your remarks. And yeah, if you have not procured a copy of the Manifold Criticism issue, please do so. There's also some strange digging work going on next door to me right now. I don't know what's happening, and my dog is making noise. So things might happen. I don't know. And I'm also going to be reading some remarks today. So as Jenny has said, my contribution to this issue was a translation of Peter Sendi's fantastic essay, The Third Eyelid. And this essay is about going to the movies and the kind of weird and miraculous choreography of blinking that movies produce for their audiences. I hope you read it, and I think Peter Sendi is talking tomorrow for this symposium. So at first I thought I might talk mostly about this essay, and in particular about blinking together as part of the singular experience of going to the movies, which is a collective experience that I and maybe you miss very, very much. I miss it really almost viscerally. But I'm also a little bit tired of thinking about what I miss. So instead, I'm going to use this occasion to share some thoughts about translation in general, speaking to our theme of monolingual criticism, or criticism that has been translated. So I'm also going to talk about a book that Jenny mentioned, a book by the French philosopher and psychoanalyst Anne Dufourmentel, her book Defensive Secrets, which actually came out early this year in January with Fordham. Can you see it? But also the sun is like encroaching on my space. And this book, I think, is going to help me articulate some ideas about translation that I've been mulling over for quite some time. I'm going to speculate about secrets in translation, and I'm going to make the wildly exuberant claim that maybe things aren't lost in translation, they just remain secret. And I think this is also speaks to the discussion about the ethics of translation, or the ethics of not translating, that I think Robin and some others were talking about in the chat. Okay, so it's a total cliche that things are lost in translation, like even that movie is a cliche, but it is also true. And the side-by-side inclusion of Zendi's English in Manifold Criticism, or Zendi's French in Manifold Criticism with my English, reminded me of how literal and material this loss often is. So if you have the issue or you're looking online, you could actually see that most of the paragraphs in English are a little bit or even significantly shorter than the French. When I translate poetry, I'm especially aware of the what gets lost: sonic textures, sonic rhymes, visual rhymes, connotations, allusion, cultural references, the way the poem looks on the page. Translating poetry, to use a technology term, is lossy. As a translator, sometimes I try my best to put back the things that have been lost, rebuilding structures, translating allusions or finding equivalents, weaving new sonic textures that have some connection to the old ones, even if they can't be the same. And of course, this building and weaving work is part of the pleasure of translation. But sometimes what gets lost stays lost. I feel like sometimes translating a poem is like opening a box of very tiny marbles, which spill out everywhere on the floor, and you can't put them back. And all you can do is take the box and signal like some marbles were here on it. In other words, sometimes the task of the translator might be just to keep the idea that something has been lost in sight, to acknowledge the loss, and to keep it around somewhere. Loss happens too in the translation of criticism and philosophy. Often, and this is somewhat obvious, it happens with key terms. For example, it doesn't come up in Peter Zendi's essay, but when I set about translating that piece, I was worried that I'd have to deal with the French term dispositif, which means kind of setup, but it's a little more specific than that. So to refer to the dispositif of cinema means the whole arrangement. You're seated in a movie theater. Your seat is usually like high-backed and padded. There's a source of light behind you. The screen is ahead, and all of the fellow spectators are around you. It's the cinematic dispositif, so to speak, that I miss so much right now, and also the dispositif that gets lost in translation. So these key terms are sometimes so lossy that they're not even translated. Think Derrida's différence or Blanchot's désouvrement, although that is translated sometimes as worklessness or unworking. In the case of Dufourmentel's In Defensive Secrets, one of these terms was au secret. In French, au secret means hidden. In a sentence, it can also mean simply to the or on the secret, as in like I let her in on the secret. It also significantly means in solitary confinement. So I thought about it for a long time, and I couldn't, and I still can't figure out any way in English to say simultaneously hidden and in solitary confinement, and to keep the word secret around. So I couldn't have both. I couldn't both have and not have the very specific carceral connotation as well as the word secret. And if anyone is listening and thinks of a way to do this, let me know. So in what I've published, I've overcompensated for the loss the first time the term occurs, and I've explained it with more words. Here's a little passage from the book. And before I read it, I'll note that the reference to, quote, the French language is Dufourmentel's. So she says, or in my English, she says, it is urgent to hear what she calls the secret life, to recognize the strain of its song in the ambient noise, to pick out its rhythm, its power, its tonality, its singularity, so as no longer ourselves to be, as the French language expresses so well, au secret, both in solitary confinement and secret, hidden. Elsewhere in the book, though, I left the French term au secret. It is my hope that readers would remember the definition I'd given earlier, even subconsciously, would feel the absence of this word's multiple meanings. But I'm also interested in the possibility that this phrase in French would remain opaque, would remain locked, would remain secretive. For this secret, hermetic nature of language when faced with the possibility of translation seemed to me, and is, as I was working on the book, integral to de Formentel's whole project. That's in fact the point of her book, A Defense of Secrets, of the power and the possibility of what remains secret. So In Defense of Secrets is itself a secretive book. Translating it sometimes felt like trying to wrestle out a secret that no one wanted to tell me. There were passages that felt disconnected, cryptic utterances and conclusions, metaphors I'd untangle and untangle until the thread frayed and fell apart. Sometimes I would ask Francophone friends about particularly elusive passage, and they would shrug and they'd say, like, wow, your guess is as good as mine. And what drove home this fact actually was Dufourmentel's untimely death in 2017. So I've never met Anne Dufourmentel, I've never heard her voice. Unlike any of the other texts I've translated, for which I've worked closely with the author or at least been given the green light to take my liberties, in this case, the author's intention remained sealed up by death. Death, which in Dufourmentel's own words is, quote, the last secret before every human life falters. This text fought me for its secrets. When I asked for them, it remained silent. I had to let it keep them. And so rather than thinking about what is lost in translation to the detriment of texts and readers, I have begun to think that lost element as instead what remains secret. What remains secret for Dufourmentel, as well as possibly for translation, can be a source of life and power. This is what In Defense of Secrets tells us. The capacity that the secret deploys in us is constantly transforming, Dufourmentel writes. It is a driving force whose creativity we have trouble explaining. The secret that is revealed in the imaginary is never eluded or an abduction. It is a world of light and shadow where we move about like animals by instinct. The secret, maybe even the secret of translation, is vital, dynamic, a living core of language. Perhaps the text-kept secrets are what makes translated literature and criticism so special. Perhaps when we read this literature, we should protect, respect, treasure, and defend what is held back rather than mourning what is lost. Dufourmentel also writes, the capacity of understanding and keeping a secret is also a skill for resisting power. The secret does not exist without the possibility of being shared, without speech to protect or betray it, without the promise of keeping it. Perhaps instead of giving up in the face of untranslatability or conversely flattening what's there into its new language, reducing difference and feigning knowledge, we might learn to sense the existence of the secret and help to keep it. Thanks.
I feel like we're going to have a lot to keep talking about with secrets and ethics. And thank you, Lindsay, for that wonderful, thought-provoking conversation starter. Our last panelist is Gazal Masadek, and she has very generously sent me some phonetic spellings of the Persian, which I'm going to attempt at. So I'm sorry if I butcher it, Ghazal. Ghazal was born and raised in Iran, where she published and still publishes poetry, criticism, and translation. She currently lives in London and is the founder of our co-host for today, Pamenar Press, an independent cross-cultural multilingual publisher. Her writings have been published by Tamas Foundation, Poetry Whales, The Stand Magazine, Plumwood Mountain, Sanoi, Oversound, and forthcoming from Changes, among others. Also Iranian publishers Morvadir, Hirmand, and Bukhara. She was one of the founders of Zir Palais, and a short-lived hub for experimental visual, textual, and performative practices in Tehran, where she also performed for 1 week her interactive poetry performance, How to Escape from Everything, in 2016. Her long poem, An Inquiry into Wanting, is published today by GAM Italy, bilingually in Italian and English, translated by Andrea Rose. She writes between genres and disciplines with a close attention to translingual, visual, and sonic performativity of language, and intertwines languages, linguistic systems, and registers using different translative methods, mostly toward creating disease. Her multilingual pieces are often playful and humorous and are set to disrupt and ridicule the notion of the neoliberal multicultural and multilingualism. She will read excerpts today from her piece titled Darman-e Darya Zadigi, Supernatural Remedies for Fatal Seasickness, highly divisible, but nevertheless in 19 sections. My English is as bad as my Persian. This piece, which I've seen some of and I'm so excited about, it's so beautiful, but it offers an extended metaphor for the experience of hospice care. Attending to death requires that the patient and carer learn to communicate in new languages. They will need to make clear their wishes using the unfamiliar diction and syntax of medical discourse. They will be haunted by their partial understanding of these languages. Supernatural Remedies for Fatal Seasickness mimics the cognitive dissonance of motion sickness by combining the conceptual metaphor of life as a journey with the villanelle form. Each of the 19 sections represents an expansion of the same number of lines in the traditional villanelle. The patient and carer must navigate through multiple languages: medical discourse, social care, religion, grief, legal languages, etc. And the end of life might be best characterized by the practice of interpreting multiple overlapping maps. So with that, I will pass it on to Ghazal. Thank you for being here, Ghazal.
Well, thanks, Emma, and thank you, Jenny, for such fantastic symposium and seminar. And also, it was great to listen to Lindsay, Robin, and Carlos. Really enjoyed it. And also looking at the grid, most of the people here are engaged into writing multilingually with translation. So it would be great to have the discussion after this. I was going to read parts of that multilingual text, Supernatural Remedies for Fatal Seasickness, and talk about it, but I thought I'd just explain about the text a little bit. Am I a host? Can I?
Yes, I think you should be able to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this text has been written in 2018, summer 2018, when we could, in fact, get to places and get ourselves motion sick. After traveling for a festival to Inishbofin, for which I had to take the plane and then 2 buses and then the ferry to get to that island. And when I got there, I was sick for 2 days because of motion sickness. So I started writing on that. A couple of months later, it was published by Gang Press, but I changed the text and added to it in 2019. So what I'm reading are parts of this new text that I changed it. This is in all right. Why it fails to start? It says it's failed to, can you see it?
No. Are you pressing the share screen at the bottom?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's.
There we go. Now we can see it.
Yes, so this text is uses multilingual texture and includes different linguistic systems. One is Persian, one is English, but it also uses the language of science, medicine, magical texts that I, at the time, was working on translating some of them from Persian, and also mathematical summons, which, as you can see, one of them here, when I read them, I use them as scores for performance when it's not a Zoom share of the text. And just before I start, I have to say, where is my text? The Persian and English that you can hear and you can see on this page that might look like they're translations of each other. They're never translations. In fact, they hardly even follow the narrative logic of each other. Aleph. Your name is Jeffrey. You're traveling by car when there are obvious benefits to bike. But the fuss starts neither on the bike nor on the car. It starts when you need to take a ferry over the channel. The fuss involves sensing nausea, vomiting, pallor, sweating, headache, dizziness, malaise, increased salivation, apathy, drowsiness, belching, hyperventilation, stomach awareness. All you need to know is every living being is affected by seasickness. Jeffrey, assimilate yourself with quack-cazaver, khozabalat, the medical practice of khozabal. Collect hearsay, but avoid judgmental shortcuts. باید توجه داشت، اینها ساخته ذهن است همه. همه چیز هرچند خزعبل خاص نیست اگر به معنی واقعی سرگیجه به سراغ انسان بیاید، به نظر می رسد که مفاهیم از معنا تهی شدند و همه چیز به طرز غریبی علمی است. Are you thinking about a bicycle versus car, Jeffrey? Are you thinking about train versus boat? Pick your poison, railway versus maritime. If the former, you need to be me, to be sitting in a car and feeling bad about everything. If the latter, read Rafuli Ginger Root and Z Horizon 191998 Living Quarters Performance at C Journals of Dardهای مرگزا 8516 298-209637 hallucination. Hypnosis is record 2000 and today APA over exerting when at C equals to dithophony measures stretching of extraocular muscle. So in this journey, if I can stop the sharing here, we follow Jeffrey and his seasickness, which the writing of the English language was from right to left, and Persian, that is from left to right, is supposed to physically makes us feel ill if you're able to read both texts fully. And in writing this, I had an inspiration from two of the multilingual writers that I'm lucky that they're here today, Eleni Stekopoulos and Virna Teixeira, that they both write about illness and health and use the language of medical science in complete different ways. In Eleni's writing, she explores the language of the narratives, illness narratives, and there's a search for healing and cure into that. Whereas in Virna Teixeira's writing, as as she, am I still sharing? Sorry, no, I'm not sharing the screen. Okay. And yes, in Virna's writing, Virna Teixeira, a poet herself, a psychiatrist and neurologist who works daily with psychiatric patients, her poetry deals with illness narratives in search of perhaps not health, but going into deeper into the meaning of illness to get into a definition for sexuality, gender fluidity, and desire. What is interesting in Virna's writing to compare with Eleni's, one of them, Virna writes monolingually. I mean, when she writes in Portuguese, she only writes in Portuguese. And when she writes in English, she writes in English. She doesn't combine both languages. But in Eleni's writing, you will see Greek coming into English, but the use of Greek language in Eleni's English writing is not just the typical what we are used to using another language into kind of ornating the text or in a form of a native informant bringing a beauty of Greek wisdom into English. In contrary to that, her writing, in fact, challenges us as she is writing about her own challenge with Greek language. So you're feeling separated from the language when you're reading the writings of Eleni, as much as she feels separation from that writing. And I have this quote from her writing: "I am not native to Greece. I'm native to no place. Immigration breaks the link between body and soil." So this writing, with mentioning the mother tongue that she feels separated from, is separating the soil from the body completely. I read a little bit more of my text. Everything looks transformed. The water has its way, just as language. Water that fills almost all the earth's depression. I was thinking about your question, you're right. The color of the sea, modified by the particles that float in it, by the angle of view, by the clearness of the day, by the reflection of the sky, by the cliffs, by the clouds, by the shadows, by the color of seafloor, by the dullness of leaden gray, by the level of seasickness of the beholder. You are right. This is not a type of sea you sculpt sandcastles on its shore. It breaks apart anything before their formation. Usually, the texts that set about talking about what they're incapable of stating start from one end of the sea, crisscrossed, up, down, left, rost, kaj. Say it's an ocean. Yani masalan harf muhimi mizanam. We have ocean sickness too. If you suffer from motion sickness, your body can travel. Yes, it can. But you won't be able to freely roam along the passages, at least not when you use a vehicle. So whatever means of transformation you use gets a dual role of getting you there and killing you meanwhile. A transformation via sea vehicles from one end of the water to the other. If you suffer from seasickness, Death always follows you. It does if you don't suffer from it. The ship is a car, is a truck, is a bus. The sea is a paved road. Disorientation plays the main role. And the fact that we all are sick of something and lost too. Like I told Jeffrey, who felt submerged, listen, a drowned man is a lost man only at sea. There's another current, the words from the other center, from the other direction. Hang on a second here. This is the definition of being lost. I read in De Khoda encyclopedia written all over it. Man hiç vakt. Hiç vakt man. Hiç vakt. Hiç vakt. Hiç vakt. هیچ وقت به تو اعتماد نمی کنم غزل من هیچ وقت هیچ وقت هیچ وقت هیچ وقت به تو اعتماد نمی کنم غزل من هیچ وقت به تو اعتماد نمی کنم غزل گم شو. This is sorry, the last part that I was hoping to show the writing of it. I showed the water, but then this would help with the disorientation anyway. That would be, yeah. I hope you got seasick by the end of it. One point that I think we later would talk about at the discussions, and I was thinking about translation of this piece, because this was translated by Safo Fathi into Arabic and French. The English was translated into Arabic, and the English was translated into French, and the Persian to Arabic, which you can imagine that creates the same dynamism on the page in terms of two-directional writing of it. And when I was looking at the translations of Safo after it was done, I realized that there's a same dynamism that happened between English and Persian is happening historically, I'm talking, between Arabic and French on the page. So the clash is there. And that reminded me when I wanted to present that piece to talk about another multilingual piece that I recently learned about, Jennifer Scapitona's Smoke Penny lyric art, Heaven Bread, which is the assemblage of multilingual chorus of industrial workers. And with listening to that performance, I don't know how many people on this Zoom meeting have seen that performance, but listening all these languages in a chorus, all languages in the world, there's like Persian, there's Chinese, English, French, all of them repeating something. In the background of it is the language of exploitation. And at the end of the piece, all you realize is that there's only foreign language, the one foreign language, and that's the language of the power and exploitation, because all the rest of the languages that were in this choir belong to us. And then among these languages, then again, that dynamism of the power and exploitation can create some unbearable power dynamism between them, that when I was writing this piece, I could feel the challenge between the power of English and Persian language. And these are languages, of course, that I daily deal with them. I end this with a quote from this fantastic book of translingual poetics, essays by different writers. I read this quote from Nakayasu, Suako Nakayasu, about multilingual poetry and translingual writing. It's just about the words. If I insert words from one language into a text in another language, that doesn't make it multilingual. And it also is about the words. The words can be passenger, vehicle, scaffold, structure. That's it for my presentation.
You can unmute and we'll make some noise for Ghazal.
Wonderful. Gazal.
That's great, Gazal.
Yeah, really beautiful. So we have some sort of questions that we formulated, kind of general questions that we sent along to the panelists that I'm happy to read as a sort of opening to a conversation. But before doing that, I wanted to invite you all to ask questions. I know I've seen some in the chat. I think Sarah Riggs might have had one, or I don't know, I saw a few. So if anyone wants to ask a question, I'd rather start with that.
Malcolm Phillips is still on it. He asked the first question about translation as an ethical good, but if you're still on here, there seemed to be a lot of interest in that from other people in the chat.
I think there's also another one that was just typed in from Sophie, which I can go ahead and read. It's a question for Lindsay, but she'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts on it as well. In theoretical attempts towards a world literature, much has been made about the idea of mutual intelligibility and shared understanding that can cross cultural and linguistic borders, i.e. in Rossetti or Damrosch. What do you make of a world literature predicated on mutual intelligibility? To what extent does this put pressure on secrets to give themselves up to be understood, even if only partially?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge, thank you, Sophie. That's a huge question. I don't have an answer. I mean, yeah, I think what I was getting at in a kind of oblique way was this idea that and this is how Du Formentel portrays the secret as well as something that resists. And so I guess I do want to say that that I think, you know, I think there is something to pay attention to. There's something there in translated literature, or in some translated literature, that does resist, and I think it is anything from a disservice maybe to a violence to put that kind of pressure on literature that must be intelligible always, you know, in order to partake of this world literature idea. On the other hand, I do think it's kind of a tightrope, because I also don't, I think, you know, I'm thinking of like Robert Frost saying, you know, poetry is what gets lost in translation. I think it's easy and perhaps sloppy to come down too quickly on the side of, well, you know, well, this is untranslatable, right? Yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think of that too. I guess I would put forth The Secret as something that as at least a site of awareness and potential that exists sort of in between the you know, in between the mandate to be translated and like utter opacity. Robin, I think you were thinking sort of about these questions too. I wonder what you think about this.
I think, you know, and I feel like there's a real connection between this question and Malcolm's question, because I think ultimately, I also like, just sorry, I'm trying to organize my thoughts. There's so much happening here, but Lindsay in talking about, and Sophie's question talking about the pressure put on secrets or on a text to be explicable. I think that there is, I'm even thinking about something I thought about a lot in translating Christina, who has in prose in general, both in her academic and in her fiction work, a lot of incredibly intricate, often extremely long sentences punctuated by very short sentences. And that is, I think, you talked, Lindsay, about the experience of having a text become shorter, sort of there's a kind of syntactical compression that happens in English. And I think it's tempting to sort of think of these questions as strictly aesthetic ones when we're translating, as to sort of how do I get this across in the most eloquent, in the neatest, in the most beautiful, in the easiest way. But I think especially when we're talking about translating things that are extremely local, that are idioms, that are references to a particular place, to a particular culture, to a particular language spoken not just in a country, but in a city or a neighborhood. When we talk about making them easier and also thinking about sort of translating from languages from the global South into, well, in my case, from into English, there is something flattening, to use a word I think you used, Lindsay, about that, about sort of who am I making this easier for and why? Who is being served by the ease with which this reference is flattened? And I think that I'm maybe mixing these two questions together, because I think sometimes to use the language of secrets, there is something secret about a local reference or about a local word or about something that is so specific to a community that it isn't automatically universalizable. And I think that is important to honor, that what cannot and shouldn't be flattened, and to think as translators about the complexity of the question of ease and of sort of making a smooth, palatable experience. I was reading recently an interview with the incredible translator, I may be mispronouncing his last name, Pierre Joyce, who's translated all of Paul Celan. And he was saying how he thinks that his translations of Celan are actually quite a bit more sort of linguistically close. So he used the word literal to the original, and that they're closer in the original to the difficulty, to the sort of unswallowability of a lot of Celan's language. And he feels that his translation, if he were to make it easier, that would be a bad translation. And I think that's, it's easy to simplify, I think, questions of sort of easy and difficult and good and bad. But I do think that there are ethical questions involved in all of these questions. And I'm sorry, I'm just I'm losing my train of thought. I'm just going back to Sophie's question quickly, but about, yes, I think the role is also that there is a duty to sort of to be thinking about what isn't going to be given up. And I think in terms of specifically translating into a language like English, which often has this sort of blanket kind of, it is published in English, therefore it is worth reading. That is a dangerous attitude to have about translation and about publishing. And I think it's something that when it comes to thinking about the sort of what languages are given a sort of, what languages are given space, there's also something dangerous, I think, about the idea that accessible is automatically good, or that accessible is automatically a force of connection, when ultimately it can also be used as a tool of unequal convenience.
I'd like to say something about the ethics of translation, that I believe that usually it's framed as a relationship between the translator and the author. And I think as a collective and personally as a translator, I'm more interested in framing the ethics of translation as a visibility issue, as you were saying, like more like what are we going to translate and why, and what voices or what discourses or, what issues are we going to locate in a different context, since the translator has that power, of like put something new in a given setting, in a different language, something that didn't exist before, and something that can reach a new audience. I think, given like the social problematic that we're currently living, I like to frame the problem of translations under that view, you know, like trying to establish this exchange or, you know, relationships, this dialogue with different cultures, with different languages. And I think that that's why, you know, this project of like recurring to what was written before instead of writing our own poems, in the case of the social outbreak here in Chile, made a lot of sense, you know, to rescue those words and try to see what other writers were saying, or, you know, what are the lessons that we can take from those writings. And yeah, I think it was Amil Al-Khalai that said that, you know, it was talking about like visibility, to give visibility to obliterated languages. That's I also think that's a very important thing. Unfortunately, we here in Chile, we basically translate a lot from English. It's a kind of an imposed second language. And I think we have a lot of interesting material to work with, but also we need other translators that are able to work from other languages, because there is a lot of things that we're missing. I mean, I was mentioning the case of Portuguese and Brazil, but we also have like few but very good translators from the Greek. And I don't know, I mean, as long as we can have more of that and we can like diversify the pool of writers that we can have access to, that'll be terrific. That'll be really good. And I think it's a problem that we need to tackle here, particularly in the South.
Well, I was thinking about how the hierarchy of different languages shifts over time, and the relation of kind of revolution to inequality. Like, at what point does English become, you know, when Facebook offers you different sentences that you can reply in English to messages, like at what point does it, like the other languages revolt? And do they do it in secret, or do they do it through English or through multilingual texts maybe?
One fantastic translation Google did to not Google, the Facebook did today, by the way. It was the biography of mine in this recent publication in Italy. So my biography was in Italian. I don't know, because when I see it on Facebook, it was translated into English. It was written, Ghazal Mosadeq is a poet and a room translator. I don't know what it was in the original, but I am a room. We all are room translators right now, you know, in the pandemic. So, yeah. But yes, sorry, Sarah, you're saying that how can it work that you know, the use of translation in social media and in Google can also be used as a form of resistance? I don't know if I understood.
No, I was just talking about, I think like in the hierarchy of languages, that English is sort of magnifying, you know, through, you know, it's using social media to do that. And I guess what I'd want to bring up is that authors writing in other languages, like often desire to be translated into English, you know, like that it comes from that as well. And I guess I'm really enjoying what I'm seeing of multilingual writing, like yours, Ghazal, in terms of like embedding those questions of difficulty and of secrets into the poetic process. So it's not as transparent a movement and a flattening of a movement to the kind of like all encompassing larger language. I'm not saying it is all encompassing. I'm just saying I think that's where the resistances need to be working.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's not offering actually the translation of the text, hiding behind it, whereas two languages can also dynamically fight and be friends also on the page. Yes, I think.
I was so interested, Ghazal, in what you were talking about in terms of having the translation from, or a multilingual text, a bilingual text in English and Persian, and then be translated into Arabic and French, and having a sort of a reconfiguration in a different landscape, in a different history of the tensions between two languages. And makes me think as well about in the presence of Cristina's work, she cites a lot this Mije anthropologist and linguist from Oaxaca named Floriberto Diaz. And so in being sort of, there are several transpositions here, because he wrote originally in the Mije language, which is indigenous to Mexico, has been translated into Spanish, which is also a colonial language in Mexico, and then translated into English, which has a colonial relationship towards Mexico. And it just, these tensions they go on for a long time and in many different directions. And yet, the more the better. To experience those tensions in as many landscapes as possible feels very important, and to have to question them and to think about how we position ourselves in relation to them as readers.
I also think that now there's more room for, like, speaking of visibility, like probably today we have more room for the visibility of the translator. I think that before, a good translation or a proper translation was one where the translator was completely unnoticeable, right? A smooth translation. While now, I guess it's more acceptable to embrace those frictions. And when a translator dares to be experimental or aggressive, or be present in the process and leave some marks, that's also, a kind of work that it seems interesting, and it's another way of establishing a dialogue with the original. I think Jen Hoffer and the Colectivo Antena have like some manifestos that points in that direction that I think are really interesting.
Maybe I'll add a couple of our questions into this discussion. I was also thinking a lot about Dictate, the Teresa Hawking Cha's book, as far as opacity goes. But this was one question that we kind of sent to the panelists before, but what is the role of translation in creating a polyvocal critical landscape? And how can multilingualism or multilingual criticism function as a disruptive force, create new experimental or hybrid forms? I'm also thinking about like the political implications of this sort of disruption and the collective voice against the singular author. Yeah, I'm not sure if that question is clear enough, but.
Maybe Emma, read the second half of that again, because I think it was kind of dense.
How can multilingual criticism function as a disruptive force to create new experimental or hybrid forms?
How can it do that? Well, one of the things I think I don't know what everyone else thinks, but it's by disrupting the expectations of another language or something that is out of as we talk, the hegemony of English language, where we are just speaking and writing in it. So by surprising that language, by hiding in another language right in front of it, and saying things that are not predicted, I think that can be a form of basically dealing with that language, understanding it in both ways, in translation, in opposition, in friendship, in a battle, just very different ways, but not simply just accepting, translating, and in a transparent way presenting. That also includes just the use of, yes, multilingual writing, slang, and also visual language into a text that starts a conversation with those languages.
I think also, like with Carlos's collective, the postering makes the work very local, and it can't be removed. It doesn't work in social media in the same way. You know, it's a lot of its power is its locality. Yeah.
Mm.
But I think it's also very versatile, because I mean, you have like particular slides that could be better. I mean, they'll function better on Instagram or Facebook, but then you have the posters that you can stick on in the walls, in the streets, or the same design you can adapt it to make a magazine. So I don't know. I mean, that's the interesting thing about like moving across different platforms, different designs, but yeah, I agree that it's a strong component, and it's a very important part of the work to go with the words in order to to make the message, I guess, more I don't know if more clear, but maybe more attractive or seducing, I guess, for people, and I don't know. It's interesting to see how it works, and how the audience reacts to it, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry. I have to jump off for an afternoon of meetings, but I didn't want to leave without verbally saying thank you to everyone. And I am having trouble tearing myself away, but I have to go.
Thanks so much, Lindsay.
Thank you, Lindsay.
It was
Thanks.
so great to hear you, Lindsay. Can't wait. Oh, she did.
Emma, do you have more from our questions, or should we? I haven't checked to see the chat.
I guess I'd be interested in hearing more about the sort of dialogue or conversation that's happening between these different pieces, and Carlos talking about, these different forms of the text that it can take on as sort of translations that are then disseminated in these different ways, but the kind of different conversations or dialogues that are happening. And I feel like you've all touched on it a bit, but maybe more on that.
I think personally, I think that it comes to me in a very organic way. I mean, I've been publishing in poetry in different formats, like free PDFs with independent press houses, with larger presses. I don't know, and homemade things that are being like giving away. So and it seems that every of those tiny products, they have their own group, they have their own kind of niche, and I think it's interesting, because we tend to say that poetry, or literature in general, is a democratic thing, and the fact is it's not very democratic sometimes, you know, so it's not very accessible sometimes, you know. Here, for example, we have to deal with the price of the books, which is really high. So if we want people to read, you know, we need to deal with that problem. And sometimes, you know, not everybody wants to release their work for free, and you cannot force people to do that. I mean, there is also like a tiny market, you know. I mean, press houses, usually some of them they got funding from the government, some they don't want to work that way, but I mean, it's the only way they can function, and we have to respect that. But also, you know, how do you do in order to make your work or the work of others, in the case of translations, more accessible? And I think, you know, using these different platforms, websites, printed magazines, Instagram accounts, independent press houses, or whatever, you know, if you diversify your platforms, I think you can have maybe, I don't know, not a large impact, but you can, you know, make things better, a little bit better for people, and make them easier to access your work, and through your work, the work of others, you know. So
I also want to tell Robin the idea of being a beginner every time that you translate. It's such a great idea. And beginning again with the text, with understanding it in the process.
I think that was Christina's line, and I think it is so. I really find that very helpful. I have found that very helpful to think about as a translator, and then of course then it translates to everything, to every other part of it, you know, as a reader, as a writer, and I think in a sort of maybe overly personal level, but I think I felt a lot of conflict about whether or not to do graduate work. And I think when I started to translate, that was sort of it was a click moment for me, in that I realized that I was sort of, I was very anxious about specializing in anything. And I think for me, translation has been a way to not have to, accept in experience of being a beginner, you know, of reading very, very closely, and of sort of letting a text teach you how to read it. And I think poetry is maybe the most visceral, or the most visible way. I mean, a poem unfolds on the page in a way that leads you through. And I think translation is a way of sort of breaking down from start to finish, and then over and over and over again, how we read. I feel like it just teaches us all to read forever, you know. And Cristina, in her essay, she also talks about the beginner as, you know, and calling it Disappropriation for Beginners as sort of an ironic manual. Of course, there are no manuals to any of this, and yet, you know, the sort of idea of reading in order to be provided with tools in itself as a sort of comforting presence.
Yeah, it's yeah, to just take every poem as the field that you're just novice in it is such a healthy way of reading.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like Eleni has another question. I actually am going to have to jump off in a minute or two to go teach, but I think when I leave, because we have so many co-hosts, everyone will be able to stay as long as you want. But I also wanted to apologize. I had to jump off early here, but there is the Eleni's question in the chat. I don't know if you can see that, Gazal?
Maybe I'll read.
Want to read it? Yeah. Okay, great. And in the meantime, I may be gone by the end of the answer, or the end of the discussion. So thank you so much to everybody.
So Eleni is asking Ghazal, she says, I loved your work, so fascinating conceptually, visually, sonically. Wonder if you would say a little more about the patient having to navigate multiple languages, healing or not healing as a multilingual practice. I've worked a lot with the idea of translation as a prime modality of healing and how art treats our conditions. That's the end of the question.
So yes, just very quickly, and because Jenny has to go, the process of the patient, the narrator with the illness, is not towards healing. It is towards that, and the end of the text, it's actually it goes to death. But it's not, again, very obvious because it's written in Persian. But the text ends with. بیایید برای مرگ دعا کنیم که بهتر شود. Then let us all pray for death to get better. So it's not looking for a cure and is not dealing for any sorts of healing. Is just, I think it's just symptoms over symptoms and worsens.
Thank you.
Did I answer you? Yeah.
Is there somebody else speaking?
No, I think Ghazal was just asking if she had answered your question.
Oh, I didn't. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, yeah, and the question of what, I mean, the relationship of death to healing or not healing. I mean, you know, of course, isn't interesting and fraught one too. And of course, and healing isn't cure. But yeah, I found that so interesting in the work. And when you said that, you know, the idea of the multilingualism that a patient has to navigate is really fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm thinking this, Eleni, this idea is making me think of the Amazigh indigenous women to now Morocco in the Atlas Mountains having songs about burning the small brush to keep there from being big fires. And this, you know, these songs are going extinct, like the, you know, so it's just interesting to think like about, like, obviously, like we need this knowledge that's embedded in these songs so badly. But just to think about how some of the secrets are embedded in languages, you know, that like that we need to go to them rather than them come to us, you know. I'm not sure. There's so many ideas that have come out of this discussion. I'm not sure where I am at this point, but
Amazing, yeah, amazing gathering and confluence. Thank you, Sarah. It's beautiful. And yeah, I mean, that brings it over to opacity also, right? Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, how the language of science or the language of medicines has become to establish itself as a hegemonic language, that it's really hermetic, as opposed to the ancestral knowledge that you were saying that every culture has, like particularly in medicine, is not, like most of the time, is not incorporated in the healing process. And so I was thinking that probably we need some other kind of translators in order to close or you know, work with that gap. And I don't know. I mean, I'm a pharmacist by trade, so I've been working a lot. I mean, and now I'm working with oncology patients, which is a terrible disease, and I've been reading a lot of like tomographies, and the language there, it's is talking about opacity, and it's really dark, and I'm really amazed, like, for example, the response of the patients when they have to read. I mean, because they got to a lab and they obtain these images and they get the report, that they read it, and it increases their anxiety because they cannot understand, and it's the same language, right? And we're talking about the same language, but at the same time it's not. So they need to take it to the physician, and the physician will translate those words into a diagnosis, and in this case into a sentence, because probably that report contains terrible news. So I don't know, I'm just kind of like throwing ideas out about this other kind of translation process that I recently have discovered, and I like to get involved with, and I'm not sure how to work with this new language. I mean, I want to work with it poetically, but I don't know. I'm just like kind of like throwing ideas out, because I think it was really interesting, the issue of like healing, which is not cure, and the language of medicine as something bizarre, opaque, hermetic, and hegemonic.
It is the language, it is kind of translation, but it also is a form of multilingual when they're intertwined, the language of the grammar with the pharmaceutical names of drugs, and then the
right. I mean, it's a code, right? I mean, it's a convention. I mean, the names mean something, but not everybody. It's like language of science. You need to interpret. You need to have certain knowledge in order to interpret what is there, what it means.
But then also you get people who are bilingual in them, and they get it. When I was at Eleni's reading, not even a week ago, at University of Texas, one of the people who attended there could understand Greek and could understand English as well. And he suggested that your words are creating a space for diaspora. And that was a great way of looking into the type of multilingual writing that she practices, and suggestion that there are always people who can understand all these different languages, and if there is a dynamism between these two languages, other than the writer, there are people who get it, and yeah.
Carl, I mean, that's so, thank you, Carlos, for bringing in your work as a pharmacist. That's so valuable, right? And dealing with the tomographies and the fear and the opacity that in that sense is, it causes symptoms, right? Aggravates the condition. And I mean, I guess one of the things that is interesting to me about, if we think about how poetry can be therapeutic or how translation can be therapeutic, is, how does the poet or the artist intervene, as you said, between those, the hegemonic language that's hermetic and can be violent, hearing the diagnosis, not understanding, and say other kinds of languages, traditional healing. I mean, I guess that's one thing that I've looked at, right, is, medical humanities often focuses on the illness narrative. That it's important to hear the patient's voice, patient's story, and it is important. I mean, many people have been silenced, but that's not the only way. I mean, so that's why I think translation becomes interesting. In what ways can poets, artists work with translation? I mean, years ago, I had curated a program with an artist named Sadie Wilcox, who's a burn survivor. And Sadie had taken, she had gotten access to the records from when she was in the hospital recovering, and all the opacity and all the codes and all the shorthand. And I had worked in university academic medicine years ago, and there's always a shorthand, and that doctors use, and it can become, or it can feel demeaning or depersonal. That's not a person, right? It's just like a bunch of codes. And Sadie had taken the record of her hospitalization, and she made an artwork out of it. She had while she, as a dancer, she filmed herself making new shapes out of the letters and the words, making a new alphabet. She had a nurse read out the notes, the medical notes, but this time filling in all the shorthand and, restoring her personhood in a way, and choosing consciously to, reflect on Sadie. And anyway, so that's just, I think, one of many possibilities for how you can take the diagnosis or the shorthand or the hermetic code or the hegemonic and treat it. That translation can be a process of treatment that's maybe like, who was it? I'm sorry now, if it was Robin or Lindsay talking about disappropriation. I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but I mean, to me, that's, it's a little resonant with that.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's fascinating, everything you just said, Eleni. Thank you so much. And in listening to both talk, really just these last few minutes, when you said, Eleni, about how in medical humanities, there's this emphasis on illness narratives, which is one way, but not the only way. And this line from the poet C.D. Wright came to mind, where she said, "Because we are going to die, an intensification of language is justified," which I think is an amazing line, and also just sort of opens up. I don't. It's one of those, you just don't know exactly what everything fits in there somehow. That there are lots of what would it mean to sort of see the imminence of death or as illness as a sort of permission to intensify ourselves and to intensify the language we use in many different ways, not necessarily narrative ways, not necessarily linear ways, but to engage with words sort of lit up by that, including the inevitability of suffering.
thank you.
Another thing I wanted to say is, like, as a healthcare worker, and thinking about this, the hegemonic language of medicine, there is an important factor that we're not including here, that is physicians, nurses. They also have a lot of kindness and compassion that they put regularly into their practice. There are exceptions, of course, but most of them, they're really devoted to their patients, and that narrative is not registered in histories, in records, and in patient records. So maybe there is, I'm just thinking that maybe a key of being, like, the translator of that language could be through kindness and compassion towards healing, and considering all the effort that those kind of weird languages are trying to convey, because it's all about facts most of the time, and medicine should be, really rigorous and should lack sentiment most of the time in order to be effective. But there's also this component that is really important in the healing process that shouldn't be put aside. And probably if we're going to tackle those issues in a poetic or creative way, I'm thinking that perhaps one way to accomplish that could be through like giving visibility to that kindness, or to that compassion that is also present in those settings.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think, a lot of the physicians and the nurses and in medical humanities, it's very important to them that they want to cultivate empathy. They want to highlight care and empathy. And I mean, when I was talking to those people directly, they would often stress that medicine is an art. It's a science, but it's also an art. And so they had very, very pointed reasons for wanting to teach literature and the arts and bring in creative writing, to medical students, to future nurses. And so I think that initiative is relevant, to what you were saying, Carlos.
Wish Virna Teixeira was here, because she was also trained in medical humanities and practices that. And
I'm going to look for her work. Thank you. Yeah.
and also in the chat, Sophie suggested talking about Glissant and poetics of relations. I think if Sophie can you come and say what we wanted to say?
Hi, sorry, I think the reference to the song was from Eleni again, so if you wanted to talk a bit more about that.
Oh yeah, in reference to Sophie's question, yeah. Oh, did I miss, Ghazal, did you want to talk more about Glissant?
Oh no, I thought Sophie wanted to, so yeah. Which we can and we should, but I don't know if there's time.
There's going to be a limit.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should end here unless there are any more thoughts about opacity or layers of opacity or any other questions we want to address.
I just wanted to say it's so great to see you, Eleni. I didn't have the chance to say hi at the beginning, so it's been a long time.
I know it has.
Yeah.
It's great to see you and everybody and meet new people.
Yeah.
This is really
Virtually me.
We have this way, as weird as it can be, it's also really wonderful.
Yeah. And there is something about, we're in such different places, right, all over the world, so at least that's one positive thing. Okay, well, thank you so much, Carlos and Ghazal and Robin, and hopefully you can all join us next week. Next week's panel is on the literary visual, which is also kind of thinking about translating into different visual forms. And yeah, so hopefully see you there, and thanks again.
Thank you so much. It was
Thank you
so great to be here.
all of you. This was so wonderful.
Thank you.
Nice.
Take care and be safe.
Everyone, be well.
Yeah, be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.